In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where science and superstition walk hand in hand, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Tonight, we begin the adventures of Detective Nathaniel Milbane and the enigmatic Victoria Pemberton as they uncover secrets that defy rational explanation. This is Victorian Cthulhu, Episode 1, The Case of the Missing Scholar. The persistent knocking at his door pierced through Nathaniel Milbane's skull like a railway spike driven by a particularly enthusiastic navvy. He lay motionless upon his sitting-room sofa, one arm trailing to the floor where his fingers had previously maintained a grip upon a tumbler of gin, a vessel now both empty and accusatory in the pale October sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. Another creditor, no doubt, he thought with the weary cynicism that had become his constant companion, come to discuss the matter of unpaid bills with the tenacity of a terrier after a rat. How tiresome. The knocking resumed, rhythmic and determined. Nathaniel opened one bloodshot eye and surveyed his domain, once a respectable gentleman's lodgings in Bloomsbury, now showing the telltale signs of a man's descent from respectability into something approaching squalor. Empty gin bottles stood sentinel among scattered books and papers, while the coal grate held nothing but cold ash. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of stale tobacco, spirits, and that particular mustiness that accompanies neglect. At 50 years of age, Nathaniel Milbane retained the physical bearing of a man who had once taken pride in his appearance. His frame was still lean and strong, his dark hair only lightly touched with silver at the temples. Yet 3 days' worth of stubble adorned his jaw, and his dressing gown, once of fine paisley silk, bore stains that spoke of recent indulgences and general disregard for personal hygiene. The knocking continued with mechanical persistence. "Bloody hell," he muttered, hauling himself upright with considerable effort. His head protested the movement vigorously, and his mouth felt as though he had been dining upon sawdust and regret. The creditors grow bold indeed if they venture to disturb a gentleman at. He squinted at the mantel clock, its hands pointing to 11 in the morning, at this unconscionably early hour. Yet, as he approached the door, his detective's instincts, dormant but not entirely extinct, noted something curious about the knocking. It was not the desperate hammering of a debt collector, nor the apologetic tapping of a tradesman. The rhythm was confident, measured, and altogether too refined for the usual parade of dunning letters made manifest that had plagued him these past months. Straightening his dressing gown with what dignity he could muster, Nathaniel Milbane opened the door to discover that his morning was about to become considerably more interesting than he had anticipated. The young woman standing upon his threshold was decidedly not what Nathaniel had expected. Where he had anticipated the pinched features and shabby attire of a creditor's representative, he found instead a lady of perhaps 27 years, fashionably dressed in a travelling costume of deep blue wool that spoke of both quality and practicality. Her bearing was confident indeed, almost assertively so, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they took in his dishevelled appearance with frank assessment. "Mr. Milbane?" Her voice carried the unmistakable inflection of an American, crisp and direct in the manner that his countrymen often found rather unsettling. "I'm Victoria Pemberton, but you can call me Vicky. Uncle Henry sent me." Nathaniel's mind, despite its current befuddled state, immediately began its habitual process of deduction. American, certainly. The accent placed her origins somewhere in the northeastern United States, possibly New York. Of considerable means, judging by the quality of her gloves and the subtle but expensive cut of her costume. Recently arrived from abroad, as evidenced by the slight disarray of her coiffure and the particular shade of fatigue that accompanied ocean travel. "I see," he said, his voice carrying more gravel than was entirely dignified. "And you, Miss Pemberton, are an American of considerable means, recently arrived from New York aboard a White Star liner, travelling with minimal servants, which suggests either remarkable independence or a family that indulges unconventional behaviour in their daughters. You're also a journalist. Note the ink stains on your right index finger and the small notebook protruding from your reticule. The young woman's eyebrows rose in what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Well, Uncle Nate, you certainly live up to your reputation, though Uncle Henry didn't mention the gin, although I am more what you would say an aspiring journalist, truth be told, but I hope to find employment soon enough. Uncle Nate? Nathaniel's expression darkened. Miss Pemberton, I must protest. If you are indeed the best friend of my uncle, I think it suits you fine. May I come in? She continued with the same directness that characterized her speech. I have a proposition that might interest you, one that comes with considerable remuneration. The mention of payment was sufficient to overcome his irritation at the familiar address. With reluctant courtesy, he stepped aside to allow her entry. She swept past him into the sitting room, her eyes taking in the evidence of his recent decline with the same clinical assessment he had applied to her appearance. Charming, she remarked, settling herself upon the least disreputable chair with apparent unconcern. Uncle Henry said you'd fallen upon hard times, but he neglected to mention you'd developed such a comprehensive dedication to self-destruction. Miss Pemberton, Nathaniel began, his tone carrying a warning edge. Vicky, she corrected firmly, and before you summon whatever remnants of masculine pride might object to my frank speaking, you should know that Uncle Henry is desperately worried about his old friend. He sent me to London with specific instructions to find you employment, preferably of the sort that might remind you why you once took pride in your work. Nathaniel found himself studying her more carefully. Uncle Henry, that would be Henry Pemberton, formerly of Scotland Yard, now enjoying a comfortable retirement in New York as a consulting detective to the wealthy and nervous. An old friend indeed, and one whose opinion Nathaniel had once valued above all others. What manner of employment? He asked, settling himself in the chair opposite her with careful dignity. A missing person case, she replied, producing a small leather portfolio from her bag. Professor Edmund Blackwood, 45 years of age, scholar of ancient languages and religious studies at University College London, disappeared 3 days ago after leaving his office Thursday evening. His wife is offering £50 for his safe return. £50! The sum represented more money than Nathaniel had seen in 3 months. Despite himself, he leaned forward slightly. The circumstances? Ah, said Victoria Pemberton with a satisfied smile. Now you're interested. Shall I continue, Uncle Nate? You shall, he replied with resignation, though I do insist you cease addressing me with such inappropriate familiarity. We'll see about that, she said, and began to outline the case that would prove to be rather more complex than either of them expected. Professor Blackwood, Victoria began, consulting her notes with practised efficiency, was last seen leaving his office at University College on Thursday evening at approximately 6:30. According to his colleagues, he had been working late on research related to medieval manuscripts in the British Museum's collection, something concerning pre-Christian religious practices in Britain. Scholarly pursuits, Nathaniel observed, his interest sharpening despite his physical discomfort. Continue. His wife, Margaret Blackwood, expected him home for dinner at 8 o'clock. When he failed to arrive, she initially assumed he had become absorbed in his work, apparently a not uncommon occurrence. However, when he failed to return by morning, she became concerned and contacted the university. And his office? Found neat and undisturbed, save for one peculiar detail. Victoria turned a page in her notebook. A book had been left open upon his desk, Megalithic Monuments of Ancient Britain, by Dr. James Ferguson, open to a specific chapter concerning stone circles in Oxfordshire. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Do you think a deliberate indication? That, said Victoria with evident satisfaction, is precisely what Mrs. Blackwood hopes we might determine. She mentioned that her husband had been unusually excited about a recent discovery, but had refused to discuss the details, claiming the research was not ready for publication. Professional discretion or scholarly paranoia? Indeed, there's another curious detail. Professor Blackwood's research notes from the past week have vanished, though his older files remain untouched. And a colleague reported seeing him in conversation with an oddly dressed gentleman outside the British Museum the day before his disappearance. Nathaniel found his analytical faculties stirring to life for the first time in weeks. The case presented several interesting anomalies that suggested something beyond a simple domestic disagreement or temporary flight from responsibility. What manner of oddly dressed? The colleague, Professor James Whitmore of Medieval Studies, described the man as tall and pale, wearing an antiquated style of dress coat and speaking with what he termed an unusual accent. Professor Blackwood appeared to know the gentleman, though Whitmore had never encountered him previously. Age? General demeanour? Difficult to determine. Whitmore observed them only briefly and from a distance. However, he mentioned that something about the stranger's manner struck him as unsettling. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers unconsciously forming the steeple that had once been his habitual gesture when considering a problem. "And you propose that we work together on this matter?" "I propose exactly that," Victoria replied. "My journalistic training has provided me with certain skills of observation and inquiry, while your experience in detection far exceeds my own. Together, we might accomplish what neither could achieve alone." "Your terms?" "We share the investigation equally. I provide the connections and the initial funding. You provide the expertise and methodology. The fee from Mrs. Blackwood we divide equally." Nathaniel considered the proposition. £25 would settle his most pressing debts and provide for modest comfort for several weeks. More importantly, the case presented genuine intellectual interest, the sort of puzzle that had once made his reputation as one of London's more capable private inquiry agents. "Very well, Miss Pemberton," he said finally, "I accept your terms, though I maintain my objection to your inappropriate familiarity of address." "Excellent, Uncle Nate," she replied with a grin that suggested his objections would be cheerfully ignored. "I suggest we begin with an examination of Professor Blackwood's office, followed by interviews with his colleagues and wife." As Nathaniel rose to dress himself for the day's work, he found himself experiencing a sensation he had nearly forgotten: anticipation. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond the bottom of a gin bottle. Whether Miss Victoria Pemberton realized it or not, she had just provided him with something considerably more valuable than employment. She had given him back his reason for being. University College London presented its austere Victorian facade to the afternoon sun as Nathaniel and Victoria approached the imposing entrance. The Gothic Revival architecture spoke of scholarly aspiration wedded to institutional gravitas, while the bustle of students and faculty suggested an intellectual vitality that Nathaniel found unexpectedly refreshing after weeks of self-imposed isolation. Professor Blackwood's office occupied a corner position on the second floor of the Arts Building, its tall windows providing ample light for scholarly pursuits. The space itself was precisely what one might expect of an academic devoted to ancient studies. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Charts and maps of archaeological sites adorned the available wall space, and the accumulated scent of old books, pipe tobacco and ink created an atmosphere of contemplative scholarship. "Here," said Victoria, indicating the desk where the mysterious book still lay open. "According to Mrs. Blackwood, nothing has been disturbed since her husband's disappearance." Nathaniel approached the desk with the careful attention that had once made him Scotland Yard's most successful detective inspector. The volume in question, Ferguson's work on megalithic monuments, lay open to Chapter 7, Stone Circles of Oxfordshire. The spine showed distinct wear at this particular section, suggesting frequent consultation. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying the focused intensity that marked him when genuinely engaged with a problem. Observe the spine of this book. See how it naturally falls open to this chapter? This page has been referenced repeatedly, far more than casual academic interest would warrant. Victoria leaned closer, her notebook at the ready. What's significant about this particular circle? According to the text, it's located near a village called Little Wickham, approximately 12 miles northeast of Oxford. Ferguson describes it as a monument of considerable antiquity, associated with unusual phenomena dating to pre-Roman times. Unusual phenomena? Local folklore, most likely. Ferguson was writing in the 1860s when such romantic notions about ancient sites were rather fashionable among antiquarians. Nathaniel continued his examination of the desk's contents. However, there's another curious detail. He knelt beside the desk, running his fingers along the floor beneath. Chalk dust, quite a quantity of it, actually, and recently deposited. Professor Blackwood's academic pursuits would not typically require such materials. Victoria made careful notes while Nathaniel continued his systematic examination. The office appeared otherwise undisturbed, half-finished correspondence lay neatly stacked, research materials were organized with academic precision, and personal effects remained in their customary positions. Yet the absence of the professor's recent research notes was conspicuous. His work habits were methodical, Nathaniel observed, studying the arrangement of materials. Everything in its place, systems maintained with scholarly discipline. Yet his most recent week's worth of notes have vanished, while older materials remain untouched. Suggesting someone knew precisely what they sought? Or that Professor Blackwood himself removed them for reasons of his own? Nathaniel straightened, his expression thoughtful. We require additional information. I suggest we interview his colleagues, then speak with Mrs. Blackwood herself. As they prepared to leave the office, Victoria paused at the window, overlooking the university's central court. Uncle Nate, do you think Professor Blackwood simply became overwhelmed by his research and fled? Academic breakdown isn't uncommon. Possible, certainly, but this chalk dust troubles me. And the specific focus on that Oxfordshire site suggests purpose rather than random flight. He joined her at the window, studying the bustling academic life below. In my experience, Miss Pemberton, when scholars disappear, they usually leave behind either everything or nothing. Professor Blackwood took only his most recent work. That suggests intention, not panic. Then where is he? That, said Nathaniel, is precisely what we intend to discover. Professor James Whitmore proved to be a man of middle years whose nervous energy and ink-stained fingers marked him as a scholar of the anxious variety. He received them in the faculty common room, a comfortable chamber appointed with well-worn leather furniture and the accumulated dignity of decades of academic discourse. Edmund had been unusually excited these past weeks, Whitmore explained, as he accepted tea from the uniformed servant with the absent-minded courtesy of long habit. Said he'd discovered something that would revolutionize our understanding of pre-Christian Britain, quite unlike his usual methodical approach to publication. In what manner unlike? Nathaniel inquired, settling himself in a wing-back chair that had evidently witnessed countless such conversations. Edmund was extraordinarily cautious about scholarly claims, never published anything without exhaustive verification, multiple sources, peer consultation, yet recently he became almost secretive about his work, declining to discuss specifics even with close colleagues. Victoria looked up from her notes. You mentioned an unusual visitor. Ah, yes. Thursday afternoon, just outside the British Museum. I was returning from my own research when I observed Edmund in conversation with a most peculiar gentleman. Whitmore's expression grew troubled. Tall fellow, exceptionally pale, dressed in a style that seemed decades out of fashion. There was something unsettling about his manner. Could you elaborate? Nathaniel asked. His speech was archaic somehow. The few words I overheard seemed to belong to an earlier century, and Edmund's demeanour he appeared almost deferential, which was quite unlike him. Edmund never deferred to anyone regarding his scholarship. Did you observe them long? Only briefly, something about the stranger made me reluctant to approach. When I mentioned the encounter to Edmund later, he became evasive, claimed it was merely a consultation about manuscript authenticity. After bidding good day to the professor, they proceeded to Hampstead, where Mrs. Margaret Blackwood maintained the comfortable home she had shared with her husband for 15 years. A woman of evident intelligence and refinement, she received them in a sitting room that reflected both scholarly interests and domestic harmony. Professor Whitmore correctly describes Edmund's recent excitement, she confirmed, her hands working nervously at her embroidery. But what he could not know was how this excitement manifested in our private life. "How so, Mrs. Blackwood?" Victoria asked gently. Edmund had been having peculiar dreams for the past week. He would wake speaking words in what sounded like a foreign language, not Latin or Greek, which I recognized from his work, but something far more ancient sounding. Nathaniel leaned forward. And did he remember the episodes? That's what troubled me most. When I mentioned them, he seemed genuinely surprised, as though he had no recollection of speaking at all. Mrs. Blackwood rose and moved to a writing desk in the corner. "There's something else. The morning after he disappeared, I found this in his study." She handed them a sheet of paper, bearing a rough sketch executed in Edmund's careful hand. The drawing depicted a stone circle with strange symbols marked around its perimeter. At the bottom, in her husband's writing, were the words, "Little Wickham, where it sleeps." "Mrs. Blackwood," Nathaniel said carefully, "had your husband shown any previous interest in artistic pursuits?" "None whatsoever. Edmund always claimed he hadn't the talent for drawing, yet this seemed to flow from his pen without conscious thought." Victoria studied the sketch intently. "These symbols around the circle, do they match any script your husband might have encountered in his research?" "I've seen his work with Celtic inscriptions, runic alphabets, even fragments of ancient British script. These symbols are unlike anything in his files." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Blackwood grasped Nathaniel's arm with desperate intensity. "Mr. Milbane, I fear something terrible has happened to Edmund. This isn't mere academic enthusiasm. It's as though something has taken hold of him, something beyond rational explanation." "We shall find him, Mrs. Blackwood," Nathaniel assured her, though privately he was beginning to suspect that their investigation might lead them into waters considerably deeper than a simple missing person case. Armed with the sketch and their growing collection of anomalies, they made their preparations for a journey to Little Wickham. Whatever awaited them in Oxfordshire, Nathaniel found himself both anticipating and dreading what they might discover. The morning train to Oxford carved its way through the English countryside with the determined efficiency that marked Victorian engineering at its finest. Steam and smoke billowed past the windows as autumn fields gave way to the gentle hills of Oxfordshire, the landscape painted in shades of gold and amber beneath an October sky that promised rain before evening. At Victoria's insistence, they occupied a first-class compartment, the leather seats and polished brass fittings providing comfort for their journey while affording privacy for conversation. Victoria had equipped herself with a small travelling case and a determined expression that suggested she viewed their expedition as an adventure rather than a potentially dangerous investigation. "Tell me about your history with detection," she said, as the suburbs of London receded behind them. "Uncle Henry mentioned you were formerly with Scotland Yard." 10 years as a detective inspector," Nathaniel replied, watching the countryside roll past. "I developed something of a reputation for cases others found challenging. Unusual circumstances, inexplicable events, problems that didn't yield to conventional investigation methods." "So what led you to private work?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant. "I encountered a case 2 years ago that changed my perspective on the nature of reality. A series of deaths in Whitechapel that the newspapers attributed to Jack the Ripper, but which I came to believe had a rather different explanation." "Different how?" "Let us simply say that I learned there are forces in this world that official channels are neither equipped nor inclined to investigate." My superiors found my theories increasingly unpalatable, and I found their willful blindness increasingly intolerable. Victoria studied his profile as he spoke. And so you struck out on your own? Indeed, though I must confess the transition has been difficult. Private clients expect discrete results, not theories about supernatural influences or ancient evils awakening in modern London. Supernatural, like magic and monsters and what not? Nathaniel turned to meet her gaze. Miss Pemberton, in my experience, the most ordinary explanations are usually correct. Professor Blackwood likely succumbed to academic enthusiasm and went herring off to investigate his discovery without informing his wife. Yet, the sketch troubles me, as does the description of his recent behaviour. I've encountered similar patterns before, always in connection with... With what? With things that are better left undisturbed. The train journey concluded at a small station some 12 miles from Little Wickham, requiring them to secure transport via local carter. The village itself proved to be quintessentially English, perhaps 200 souls centred around an ancient church and village green, stone cottages with thatched roofs arranged along narrow lanes that had likely remained unchanged for centuries. The King's Head Inn dominated one side of the green, a Tudor-era building with heavy beams and diamond-paned windows that spoke of age and solid English hospitality. Yet, as their cart approached the village, Nathaniel noted something that struck him as odd. "Miss Pemberton," he said quietly, "observe the village green. What do you notice?" Victoria studied the scene before them. It's quite charming, though rather quiet for midday. Precisely. No children at play, no women hanging washing, precious few signs of normal village activity. For a community this size, such quietude suggests either extraordinary industry or extraordinary caution. The innkeeper who greeted them at the King's Head was Thomas Hartwell, a man of perhaps 50 years whose weathered face and nervous energy suggested someone accustomed to managing both business and secrets. His welcome was cordial but carried an undertone of wariness that Nathaniel immediately recognized. "London visitors?" Hartwell inquired as he showed them to their rooms. "Don't see many travellers this time of year. Village isn't much to recommend it to outsiders." "We're interested in local history," Victoria replied with her characteristic directness, "particularly any ancient monuments or sites of archaeological interest." The change in Hartwell's demeanour was immediate and unmistakable. His face paled, and his hands stilled on the luggage he had been arranging. "I'm sorry, miss, but there's nothing like that around Little Wickham. You might try the next village over." "Curious," said Nathaniel mildly, "because this map clearly shows a megalithic site just 2 miles north of here, and our research suggested it might have drawn a London professor here recently." Hartwell's reaction confirmed their suspicions. Something about the stone circle had the villager thoroughly frightened. The common room of the King's Head that evening presented a tableau of rural English life that might have graced any number of sentimental novels, a fire crackling in the ancient hearth, heavy oak beams supporting the low ceiling, and the warm glow of oil lamps creating pools of golden light throughout the chamber. Yet Nathaniel observed that conversation ceased whenever he or Victoria approached other patrons, and several locals departed earlier than seemed natural for a village gathering place. As they settled at their table near the fireplace for dinner, Victoria studied Nathaniel across the flickering candlelight. "Uncle Nate," she began, cutting into her portion with practiced efficiency, "do you believe in things beyond this mortal world? Spirits, ghosts, things that cannot be explained by rational thought?" Nathaniel paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "An interesting question, Miss Pemberton. I take it you do?" "Absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "I'm convinced that ghosts and spirits exist among us." "Indeed? And what has convinced you so thoroughly?" Victoria's expression grew guarded, and she looked away toward the fire. "I have my reasons. Personal ones." Nathaniel observed her carefully, noting the subtle shift in her demeanour. "I see. Well, to be perfectly honest, Miss Pemberton, I suspect that ghosts and spirits are the least of our worries. Her eyes snapped back to his. What do you mean by that? Precisely what I said. The supernatural forces we may be dealing with here. He gestured vaguely toward the village beyond the walls. They may make common phantoms seem rather tame by comparison. You speak as though you have experience with such things. Perhaps I do, perhaps I don't. Nathaniel took a sip from his ale. You have your secrets, Miss Pemberton, and I have mine. They ate in contemplative silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Victoria set down her fork with decision. The villagers are hiding something, she declared. Did you notice how quickly the conversation ended when we mentioned the stones? And that look the innkeeper exchanged with his wife? She turned in her chair and raised her voice slightly. Excuse me, sir, might we have a word? Thomas Hartwell moved between tables with the nervous energy of a man hoping to avoid unwanted attention, but he had no choice but to succumb to Victoria's persistence, and he approached reluctantly. Mr. Hartwell, Nathaniel began, his tone carrying the authority he had once wielded as a Scotland Yard inspector, we're investigating the disappearance of Professor Edmund Blackwood, a scholar from University College London. He was last seen 3 days ago, and evidence suggests he came to Little Wickham seeking information about your local stone circle. I told you already, sir, Hartwell replied, polishing a glass with unnecessary vigour. There's no such thing hereabouts. Yet you seem remarkably nervous for a man simply providing tourist information, Victoria observed, and your patrons grow silent whenever ancient sites are mentioned. That suggests knowledge rather than ignorance. Hartwell glanced around the nearly empty room, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Some things are better left alone, sir. That place. It's not safe. Grounds unstable. Church vestries had it fenced off for years. Fenced off or forbidden? Nathaniel asked sharply. The innkeeper's face went white. You don't understand. There's been stories about that place going back generations. Bad dreams, they say. People going missing, found days later with no memory of where they'd been. And Professor Blackwood? Aye, he was here, asked the same questions you're asking, wouldn't listen to warnings, just like... Hartwell stopped himself abruptly. Just like whom? Victoria pressed. Some years back there was an archaeologist came down from London, a fine gentleman, all enthusiasm and scientific method. Spent a week excavating up there, making drawings, taking measurements. Hartwell's hands trembled slightly as he continued polishing the glass. Found him a fortnight later, wandering the countryside in his nightclothes, speaking in tongues. Never was quite right afterwards. Nathaniel exchanged a significant glance with Victoria. What manner of not quite right? Claimed he'd seen things, learned things that weren't meant for human knowledge. Kept talking about the sleeper and doors that should remain closed. His family took him back to London, but we heard he ended his days in Bethlehem Hospital. And you believe Professor Blackwood met a similar fate? I know he went up there, Hartwell admitted reluctantly. Saw him heading north out of the village 3 mornings back, carrying a big leather satchel. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since. Victoria leaned forward. Mr. Hartwell, if Professor Blackwood is in danger, surely you have an obligation to help us find him. Miss, you don't understand what you're asking. That place. He gestured vaguely northward. It's old. Older than the church, older than the village, older than anything Christian in these parts. Some things should stay buried. Nevertheless, said Nathaniel with quiet determination, we intend to investigate, with or without your assistance. Hartwell studied their faces, reading the resolution he found there. Finally, with the air of a man confessing to grave sin, he spoke. The path starts behind the old church. Follow the stone markers. They're ancient, carved with symbols that hurt to look at too long. 2 miles through the woods, up the hill to the clearing. Will you guide us? Not for all the gold in London, Hartwell replied firmly. But I'll give you this advice. Don't go alone, Don't stay after dark, and whatever you find up there, don't try to understand it. Some knowledge isn't meant for human minds." As they retired to their rooms that night, Victoria paused at Nathaniel's door. "Uncle Nate, do you think Hartwell's warnings have any foundation beyond local superstition?" "Miss Pemberton," Nathaniel replied thoughtfully, "in my experience, the most persistent superstitions usually contain a kernel of truth. Whether that truth is supernatural or merely dangerous remains to be seen." "And if we find Professor Blackwood?" "Then we extract him immediately and return to London. But I suspect," he added with a grimness that made Victoria shiver, "that we may discover the situation is considerably more complex than a simple rescue mission." Outside their windows, the October wind rose, rattling the ancient timbers of the King's Head, and carrying with it sounds that might have been owls calling, or maybe something far less natural announcing its presence in the darkness. Dawn broke grey and misty over Little Wickham, the autumn air carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as Nathaniel and Victoria prepared for their expedition to the Stone Circle. Hartwell provided them with a substantial breakfast and a canvas sack containing provisions, his manner suggesting a man equipping travellers for a journey from which they might not return. "Follow the path behind St. Winifred's," he instructed, indicating the ancient church that dominated the village's spiritual landscape. "The markers are Saxon, carved into standing stones every quarter-mile. Can't miss them, though you might wish you could." The path began innocuously enough, a well-worn track leading through woodland that had probably served the local population for centuries. Yet as they progressed northward, following the mysterious stone markers that did indeed bear unsettling carved symbols, the very atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. "These carvings," Victoria observed, pausing to examine one of the marker stones, "they're similar to the symbols in Professor Blackwood's sketch, but far older." "I disagree with Mr. Hartwell. These seem older than Saxon," Nathaniel mused. "Meant to guide travellers, though whether toward their destination or away from danger remains unclear." The woodland gradually gave way to wilder country as they climbed the gentle slope leading to the hilltop clearing. Ancient oaks twisted into fantastic shapes lined their route, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. No birds sang in these trees, and the usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, scurrying creatures, the whisper of wind through branches, seemed muted, as though nature itself held its breath. After 2 hours of steady walking, they crested the hill and found themselves at the edge of a circular clearing, perhaps 50 yards in diameter. At its centre stood the stone circle that had drawn Professor Blackwood from his comfortable London existence into whatever fate had befallen him. 12 standing stones, each roughly twice the height of a man, formed a perfect circle around a central monolith that rose even higher. The stones themselves were weathered by millennia, their surfaces bearing the patina of age that spoke of pre-Roman origins. Yet it was not their antiquity that struck the visitors most forcefully, it was the sense of brooding presence that emanated from the site, like heat from glowing coals. "My God," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible in the unnatural stillness, It's watching us." Nathaniel felt it too, the sensation of being observed by something vast and patient and utterly alien to human experience. The pressure was almost unbearable, and instinctively he reached into his coat, withdrawing a silver hip flask. He took a quick swig of gin, the familiar burn providing momentary comfort against the otherworldly dread. Victoria's disapproving glance was sharp and unmistakable, but Nathaniel pointedly ignored it, replacing the flask without comment. His detective's training compelled him to approach methodically, searching for physical evidence while trying to ignore the growing pressure he felt building behind his eyes. "Here," he called, kneeling beside one of the standing stones. "Fresh boot prints, size and pattern consistent with gentlemen's walking shoes. Professor Blackwood was indeed here." Victoria joined him, her notebook at the ready despite the tremor in her hands. "The ground around the central stone has been disturbed, recently, by the looks of it." A Approaching the central monolith, they discovered evidence of excavation. Someone had been digging at the base of the great stone, creating a narrow opening that led down into darkness. Beside the excavation lay a discarded leather satchel, its contents scattered by wind and weather. Professor Blackwood's research materials, Nathaniel said grimly, gathering the scattered papers, his notebook, correspondence, sketches of the symbols. But where is the man himself? Victoria approached the dark opening at the base of the central stone with the fascination of a scholar overcoming the natural fear of the unknown. "Uncle Nate, there's something down here. I can feel air moving. It's not just a shallow pit." As Nathaniel joined her at the edge of the excavation, both visitors felt an inexplicable unease settle upon them. In the afternoon light, it was almost as if the symbols carved into the central stone were glowing with some inner radiance, though surely it was merely a trick of shadow and sunlight. From somewhere far below came a sound that might have been a wind rushing through hidden passages, or perhaps something altogether more disturbing. It was a sound that brought to mind vast spaces and patient waiting. And from the darkness beneath the stone, faint but unmistakable, came a human voice speaking words in no earthly language. "Professor Blackwood," Victoria breathed. "Indeed," said Nathaniel, his face pale but determined. "It appears our investigation has just become considerably more urgent." As they prepared to descend into whatever lay beneath the ancient stone, neither could shake the feeling that they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The October wind picked up, howling through the stone circle with a voice that seemed almost alive, carrying with it the scent of things long buried and better left undisturbed. The narrow opening at the base of the central stone proved to lead not to a simple pit, but to a carefully constructed passage that descended into the earth at a steep angle. The stonework was ancient beyond measure, predating any recorded civilization in Britain, yet it showed signs of recent disturbance where Professor Blackwood had enlarged the opening to permit human passage. "Light," Nathaniel muttered, producing an oil lantern from his equipment bag and striking a match to illuminate the wick. The warm flame cast dancing shadows ahead, revealing smooth stone walls covered in the same unsettling symbols they had observed above. "Are you certain about this, Uncle Nate?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested determination rather than hesitation. Hartwell's warnings seemed rather emphatic. "Professor Blackwood is down there," Nathaniel replied grimly. "Whatever has become of him, we cannot abandon him to it." The descent proved longer than anticipated, perhaps 30 feet through the angled passage before it opened into a circular chamber of considerable size. The walls here were carved from living rock, their surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern's flickering glow. Among the bewildering array of carvings, one particular image appeared with unsettling frequency, a large eye with heavy, closed lids, surrounded by radiating lines. Nathaniel found his gaze drawn to this symbol repeatedly, though he could not say why the image filled him with such unease. The air was cold but not stale, suggesting ventilation from some unknown source. In the centre of the chamber stood what could only be described as an altar, a raised platform of black stone surrounded by 13 niches cut into the walls. Each niche contained artifacts of obvious antiquity, carved figurines, metal implements of unknown purpose, and what appeared to be bound volumes written in scripts that predated any known alphabet. And before the altar, in a trance-like state that suggested neither sleep nor waking consciousness, sat Professor Edmund Blackwood. The figure hunched against the altar was barely recognizable as the distinguished academic described by his wife. Professor Edmund Blackwood had once been a man of scholarly bearing, tall, with greying hair, and the kind of precise posture that spoke of years spent hunched over ancient texts. Now his clothes were torn and stained, his usually neat beard tangled and unkempt. His face, gaunt from 3 days without proper sustenance, bore the hollow-eyed look of a man who had gazed too long into forbidden knowledge. "Professor Blackwood," Victoria called softly as they approached. "Can you hear me?" The missing scholar turned toward them with movements that seemed disconnected from conscious will. His eyes were open but unfocused, and his lips moved in constant whisper, speaking words that belonged to no human language, though occasionally Victoria caught fragments that chilled her. Awakening. The sleeper turns, and most disturbing of all, it dreams of waking. In his hands he clutched a manuscript of obvious age, its pages covered in the same symbols that adorn the chamber walls. "Professor," Nathaniel said more firmly, "your wife is desperately worried. We've come to take you home." Blackwood's gaze focused on them with visible effort, consciousness struggling to reassert itself against whatever influence held him in thrall. "The knowledge," he whispered in English, his voice hoarse from days of speaking in tongues. "The beautiful, terrible knowledge. It speaks to me in languages that predate human civilization." The sleeper stirs. The door trembles. "What door?" Victoria asked, though something in her mind recoiled from learning the answer. "The barrier between what is and what should never be," Blackwood replied, his voice gaining strength as human awareness returned. "I came here seeking academic understanding, but I found something far more dangerous. The symbols aren't just decoration, they're a warning, a seal. And his face crumpled with horror, I've been weakening it." As if summoned by his words, the symbols on the chamber walls began to emit that same cold radiance they had witnessed above. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and from somewhere far below, deeper even than this ancient chamber, came a sound like breathing or the slow rhythm of a vast heart beating. As they approached the professor, the manuscript in his hands fell open, revealing pages covered in fresh additions written in Blackwood's careful scholarly hand. Nathaniel's eyes scanned the new text, written in English, but the content defied rational comprehension. Descriptions of cosmic entities that existed before human consciousness, mathematical proofs that reality itself was merely a fragile bubble floating in an ocean of chaos, and ritual instructions for opening the way for the return of ones of old. One phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the mad scribblings: "The dreaming one stirs beneath the foundation of all things." The implications struck Nathaniel with sickening clarity. "We need to leave," he said urgently, reaching for Blackwood's arm. "Whatever is happening here, we must get clear of it." "I couldn't stop myself from writing," Blackwood whispered. "The knowledge forced itself through me, using my hand to record its presence. Each page I transcribed weakened the ancient barriers a little more." The breathing sound from below grew louder, more distinct, as though something immense was stirring to wakefulness after eons of slumber. The walls of the chamber began to vibrate, and loose stones fell from the ceiling as whatever lay beneath pressed against its ancient prison. "Professor," Victoria said, with remarkable calm given the circumstances, "is there a way to repair what you've undone?" "The binding ritual," Blackwood replied, hope flickering in his eyes. "The original builders included instructions for renewing the seal, but it requires someone with knowledge of the symbols to speak the words of containment, and He looked at his hands with revulsion. "I'm not certain I can resist the influence long enough to complete it." From the darkness below came a new sound, not breathing now, but a voice speaking in harmonics that human ears were never meant to hear. The voice seemed to promise knowledge beyond imagining, power over reality itself, transcendence of every limitation that bound human consciousness. And despite every instinct screaming at them to flee, all three found themselves taking steps toward the altar where the manuscript lay open, its pages fluttering though no wind stirred in the chamber. "Fight it," Nathaniel commanded, though his own will seemed no stronger than his companions'. "Whatever it offers, the price is too high." As the cosmic voice grew stronger, and the ancient chamber shook with increasing violence, their struggle against superhuman influence became a battle for the very survival of human sanity in a universe where human consciousness was merely an accident of cosmic indifference. The voice from below grew in power and complexity, speaking in harmonies that bypassed rational thought and appealed directly to the deepest hungers of human ambition. Professor Blackwood's academic mind reeled under the assault of promised knowledge, while Victoria felt her journalistic curiosity transforming into desperate need to witness and record cosmic truth. Even Nathaniel's practiced skepticism wavered before revelations that rendered earthly mysteries trivial by comparison. "Fight it," he repeated, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Remember why we came here." It was Victoria who provided their salvation, though she would never fully understand how. Instead of attempting to resist the supernatural influence through force of will, she began speaking about the entirely ordinary life that awaited Professor Blackwood's return, his wife's worry, the roses they had planted together, the simple domestic routines that anchored human existence in reality rather than cosmic abstraction. "Professor," she said, her voice cutting through the alien harmonies, "Margaret made me promise to bring you home. She said to tell you that the roses you planted together are finally blooming." The personal connection pierced through the supernatural influence like sunlight through storm clouds. Blackwood blinked, consciousness returning to his eyes as he focused on something smaller and more precious than cosmic enlightenment. "Margaret," he whispered. "Yes. Oh God, what have I done? The symbols." They promised knowledge, but the price. He looked at the manuscript in his hands with horror. "I have to stop this. I have to repair what I've damaged." Working together with desperate efficiency, they attempted to reverse the cosmic damage Blackwood's transcriptions had wrought. The professor, his academic training finally overcoming supernatural influence, began reading binding words in the ancient language, while Nathaniel and Victoria rearranged ritual implements according to his increasingly frantic instructions. The chamber resisted their efforts with growing violence. The stone walls cracked, sending fragments raining down upon them. The temperature plummeted until their breath formed clouds in the air. From the depths below came sounds of something vast pressing against barriers that grew weaker with each passing moment. "The central text," Blackwood gasped, his voice straining against forces that sought to silence him. "I must read the central binding, but the influence, it's so strong." Spectral figures began materializing in the chamber, robed forms that might once have been human but had long since transcended or surrendered mortality in service to whatever lay beneath. They moved to prevent the completion of the binding ritual, their touch promising revelation and damnation in equal measure. Victoria proved her courage by physically placing herself between Blackwood and the advancing spirits, while Nathaniel, drawing upon reserves of will forged during years of confronting London's supernatural mysteries, added his voice to the binding words despite not understanding their meaning. As Blackwood spoke the final phrases of the ancient ritual, the chamber erupted in cosmic fury. The symbols on the walls flared with light that burned the retina, while from below came a shriek of frustration that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. For one terrifying moment, the barriers between dimensions thinned to gossamer, and all three glimpsed something vast and alien pressing against the boundaries of their world. Then, suddenly, silence. The supernatural presence withdrew, the spectral figures faded, and the chamber became merely an ancient underground room once again. The manuscript in Blackwood's hands crumbled to dust, its dangerous knowledge returned to the oblivion from which it should never have emerged. "Is it finished?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Blackwood replied, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "The seal is restored. I don't know if as strong as before, but strong enough. But such things," he shuddered, "such things are patient. They can wait." As they made their way back through the passage to the surface, none spoke of what they had witnessed. Some experiences transcended ordinary language, leaving only the shared understanding of those who had glimpsed truths too large for human comprehension. The October sun had never seemed so welcome as when they emerged from the ancient chamber, breathing free air and feeling solid earth beneath their feet. Behind them, the stone circle stood silent and seemingly innocuous, just another ancient monument dotting the English countryside. But Nathaniel knew they would all carry the memory of what lay beneath, and the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than most people could imagine. The train returning to London seemed almost supernaturally mundane after their experiences beneath the Oxfordshire countryside. As evening settled over the English landscape, Nathaniel and Victoria sat in comfortable first-class accommodation while Professor Blackwood dozed fitfully in the seat opposite, his ordeal having left him physically and emotionally exhausted. They had agreed upon a version of events that would satisfy both Mrs. Blackwood's need for answers and society's requirement for rational explanation. The professor had suffered an academic breakdown brought on by overwork and scholarly pressure. He had been discovered in a state of exhaustion near the ancient site, his lost days attributed to temporary memory loss induced by stress and exposure. It was, in its way, perfectly true. Edmund Blackwood had indeed become so absorbed in his research that he had lost track of ordinary reality. They simply omitted the supernatural particulars that had transformed academic enthusiasm into cosmic horror. Nathaniel gazed out at the darkening countryside, his mind cataloguing the case's unresolved elements, the symbols that had no place in any academic text, the manuscript that seemed to write itself. And a puzzle still to solve was the mysterious gentleman whom Blackwood had encountered outside the British Museum. Blackwood, when asked, had brushed him away as unconnected to the matter, but Nathaniel saw his eyes dart in panic at the question. Who had he been? And what role had he played in drawing an innocent scholar towards such dangerous knowledge? These questions would remain unanswered for now, filed away in that corner of his mind reserved for cases that defied conventional resolution. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as the lights of London began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "To Professor Blackwood, I mean." "He returns to his wife a changed man," Nathaniel replied thoughtfully. "More cautious about his research, certainly, but perhaps also more appreciative of simple human connections. I suspect he will quietly remove the dangerous manuscript from circulation and focus his future studies on less perilous subjects." "And us? This partnership of ours?" Nathaniel studied her face in the lamplight of the railway carriage. The young American woman who had knocked on his door 3 days ago bore little resemblance to the capable investigator who had helped prevent cosmic catastrophe. Their shared experience had forged something stronger than mere professional association. "I suspect, Miss Pemberton, that London holds many mysteries that would benefit from both your American directness and my English skepticism. Though I do insist you cease addressing me with inappropriate familiarity." "We'll see about that, Uncle Nate," she replied with a grin that suggested their working relationship would continue to evolve on her terms rather than his. As Professor Blackwood stirred from his uneasy slumber, consciousness returning to eyes that had looked upon cosmic truth and chosen human love instead, he spoke quietly of his experience. "The knowledge it offered," he said, his voice barely audible above the railway's rhythmic clatter, "was seductive beyond description. Every question that has plagued human understanding, every mystery that has driven scientific advancement, all of it was there, waiting to be grasped." "Yet you chose to refuse it," Victoria observed. "I chose Margaret," Blackwood replied simply. "The roses we planted together, the quiet evenings by our fire, the simple pleasure of reading to her while she embroidered. When measured against such commonplace treasures, cosmic revelation seemed rather hollow." Nathaniel nodded approvingly. Wisdom often lies in recognizing which questions should remain unanswered. As their train pulled into London's Paddington Station, the city's gas lamps twinkling like earthbound stars in the October evening, all 3 passengers carried with them the knowledge that they had witnessed something that would forever change their understanding of reality. Yet they also carried the satisfaction of having chosen human values over cosmic ambition. Professor Blackwood would return to his wife and his scholarly pursuits with deeper appreciation for both. Victoria Pemberton had discovered a calling that combined her journalistic instincts with investigative skills she never knew she possessed. And Nathaniel Milbane had found both a partner and a renewed sense of purpose that promised to pull him back from the edge of self-destruction. "I have a feeling," Nathaniel said as they prepared to disembark, "that our investigation into Professor Blackwood's disappearance was merely the beginning." "I certainly hope so, Uncle Nate," Victoria replied. "London suddenly seems full of possibilities." As they made their way through the bustling station, three people bound together by shared experience and mutual respect, none could know what mysteries awaited them in the gaslit streets of the greatest city in the world. But all three were certain that whatever challenges arose, they would face them stronger. Epilogue. 1 week later, Nathaniel Milbane's lodgings in Bloomsbury bore little resemblance to the scene of squalor that had greeted Victoria Pemberton on that first morning. The windows had been cleaned, allowing October sunlight to stream across organized bookshelves and tidy work surfaces. A discreet brass nameplate beside the door read, "N. Milbane, Private Inquiries," while fresh flowers in a crystal vase suggested the influence of feminine sensibilities in the establishment's recent renovation. Victoria had taken lodgings nearby, a comfortable set of rooms that served both as residence and office for her growing reputation as a journalist, specializing in unusual stories. Her American background and connections provided access to sources that traditional English society might have found difficult to penetrate, while her demonstrated courage in dangerous situations had earned respect among London's more unconventional residents. The partnership between the experienced detective and the eager journalist had proven remarkably effective. Where Nathaniel's methods were systematic and thorough, Victoria's approach was intuitive and boldly direct. Their complementary skills had already attracted the attention of clients seeking assistance with problems that fell outside conventional police work. "The next case, Uncle Nate," Victoria said, consulting a letter that had arrived with the Morning Post. "What do you make of it?" Nathaniel accepted the correspondence with the careful attention he now brought to all potential investigations. A missing heiress and reports of strange lights and ghostly music heard at midnight on Hampstead Heath. The client is offering substantial remuneration for discreet inquiry. "Sounds perfectly ordinary," Victoria observed with deadpan humour. "Perfectly," Nathaniel agreed, though his expression suggested anticipation rather than scepticism. "When shall we begin?" London, with all its mysteries and dangers, awaited their investigation. And so ends our first journey into the shadows of Victorian London, where ancient horrors stir beneath the veneer of civilized society. But this is merely the beginning of Nathaniel and Victoria's adventures into the unknown. If you enjoyed this tale of cosmic horror and Victorian mystery, please give it a like. It helps other seekers of dark stories find us in the fog. And subscribe to Victorian Bedtime Story for more cases that blur the line between reason and madness. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, some doors are better left unopened.